Hey there students, Tom Richey here with Marco Learning. In this video, I'm going to give you a brief overview of Unit 5 in the AP European History course, which focuses on conflict, crisis, and reaction in the late 18th century. Now, in the previous two units, we've looked at the construction of states in Europe, European states, which are replacing this old feudal order built on models of absolutism and constitutionalism. And then in Unit 4, we saw how these intellectual movements are fueling the way that people think and also changing the economy. And so what we're looking at in the late 18th century, it is very focused on Britain and France and the rise of these empires and global markets and how these states are going to change. So we see here that Europeans have come to dominate the global economy at this point, and you have commercial rivalries between these European states. Now, we remember after the War of the Spanish Succession, Louis was still in this dynastic kind of mindset, Louis XIV, and the British are thinking, let's use this opportunity that we have here in Utrecht to increase our naval power. And so with the British getting Gibraltar in exchange for allowing one of Louis's relatives to rule in Spain, the British are setting themselves up to control a global empire. And what we see is the British reach as far as India. And of course, we've got the 7 Years' War, which put Britain largely in charge of North America as well. So Britain has now got this empire, which of course the French have their revenge in the American Revolution, siding with the American colonists, helping them get their independence, which then of course altered the global balance of power. Now, the French had to pay a price for this because they had had a pretty tough financial situation for a long time, and their involvement in the American Revolution was something that really broke the bank. And so, first of all, you've got this fiscal crisis, and then you have Enlightenment ideas, which are also undermining the old regime. Remember the whole idea of the three orders, of the clergy, the nobility, and then everyone else. Nobody really questioned this old regime before the Enlightenment, but when you bring in Enlightenment ideals which undermined hereditary nobility in the church and combine that with a financial crisis, and that the French are seeing that this British constitutional monarchy seems to be working out for them, because we have seen dominance in Europe really moving from the French to the British. And so the French started to think about, well, what do we need to do? And the bourgeoisie, this group of professionals, the professional class, these people who were what we would call white collar, they don't work with their hands, they are lawyers and professors and physicians and merchants. These people are wanting to construct a constitutional monarchy on the British model. So the first phase of the French Revolution is what we know as the liberal phase, which created a constitutional monarchy and abolished hereditary noble privileges, and also nationalized the Catholic Church with the civil constitution of the clergy. So this is an attempt to create something that is more on the constitutional model, because the absolutist model was seen to be failing. Now, of course, the French Revolution quickly got radicalized, and so we go from the liberal phase of the revolution to a more radical phase, which was dominated by two groups, the Jacobins and the sans-culottes. And as we go into the radical phase, that's where we're getting into the guillotine and we're cutting off heads. The person you need to be most familiar with during this radical phase was Robespierre. And Robespierre led this government that really sought not to just bring traditional institutions in line with the nation, but to completely obliterate them. Instead of nationalizing the Catholic Church during the Reign of Terror, we see a complete policy of de-Christianization. Instead of liberal reforms to create a market economy that's not as much controlled by the state, we see the fixing of prices and wages. And so we really see a proto-socialist, almost proto totalitarian government for a brief time. Now, remember, this crazy radical part of the French Revolution only lasts for a couple of years. And with that, we go into the Directory for about 5 years, followed by the Napoleonic phase. Now, the wars of the French Revolution are very important because we mentioned the absolutist armies, which Louis XIV had an army of 400,000 people. Now, we get to the French Revolution and we're seeing these much larger patriotic armies, that we have this mass conscription, because now you're not just fighting for your king, you're fighting for your nation, for the French nation. Remember, this is a theme of this, that we're going away from this idea that you are part of the church, the first estate, or you're part of the aristocracy, the second estate, or you're one of the third. But now everyone is part of the nation. And this is where the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau is very important here, and this idea of classical republicanism and this social contract where people are subordinated to the state, that your interests are part of the interest of the state. And that's something we also see in the neoclassical art of Jacques-Louis David when we look at something like the Oath of the Horatii, where we see these young Romans who are swearing an oath to the state. Now, we also see in the French Revolution the birth of modern feminism. There really was no feminist movement to speak of before the French Revolution, and thanks to Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges, we start to see advocacy for women's rights and for women to participate in the public sphere. Now, of course, enter Rousseau again, and Rousseau, the Enlightenment philosopher, believed in traditional gender roles and separate spheres for women. And the French Revolution is not just confined to France. And of course, that was the fear of the European nobility, that this is going to spread. And it not only started to lead to unrest in other European countries, but led to a slave revolt in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, led by Toussaint L'Ouverture. And that led, of course, to the creation of Haiti. Now, the French Revolution has something of a mixed legacy, because on one hand, this is really the first time where when you see the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, that it says that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. That had never been said before. So when we think about equality and human rights, this is one legacy of the French Revolution, but also we cannot ignore this wanton violence. Or when you look through the eyes of someone like Edmund Burke, an Englishman who looked and said, look, they've destroyed their traditional institutions, and traditional institutions such as the church and the monarchy. These were institutions that led to stability. So the French Revolution had a very harsh, destabilizing effect on the French nation. Now, that is where Napoleon comes in, because after everything is turned into a mess, then somebody's got to unite the nation and put it back together. Now, to understand Napoleon, what we need to understand is that the French Revolution is not just about participatory government or republicanism or voting and having a say, but it is also about the construction of a French nation. And that is why Napoleon is really, in a lot of ways, if you ask me, kind of the capstone of the French Revolution. That perhaps, okay, well, he was a dictator, but at the same time, Napoleon was a dictator, an emperor, if you will, officially. He was someone who was popular with the people. He did things that were popular with them. For example, his concordat with the Catholic Church. When Robespierre, during the Reign of Terror, had de-Christianized France, he was taking away the religion of the French people. He was taking away their God that they prayed to, their priest who married and buried them. And Napoleon, seeing that this is the religion of the French people as a whole, brought the Catholic Church back. Now, he brought it back in a way that was different than before. Now, Napoleon could be regarded as an enlightened absolutist, because when he made the Catholic Church the majority religion, he did not make it the official official religion. It is the religion of the majority, but people of other faiths are able to pray as they want. So in that sense, Napoleon's reign is in a lot of ways synonymous with the principles of the Enlightenment. Now, also Napoleon is building a French nation and saying that France is mostly Catholic. Now, also another reform of Napoleon's was the Napoleonic Code. For the first time, you actually have one law in France. Louis XIV said one king, one law, one faith. Napoleon, with the Napoleonic Code, gave France for the first time a single set of laws. And these laws, of course, rolled back some of the gains that women had seen during the radical phase of the revolution, but at the same time, his laws about women weren't any more regressive than other laws that existed in Europe at the time. Now, Napoleon also was able to dominate Europe militarily and use these tactics in order to exert control over most of the European continent. Now, he wasn't so good at unconventional warfare, which landed him into some trouble in Spain and in Russia. Napoleon was almost universally opposed by the European aristocracy because as these patriotic French armies went through Europe, they brought these ideas of nationalism with them. And remember, this is where Napoleon is a child of the French Revolution, that France really becomes a nation under Napoleon. And so these nationalist uprisings in these other countries, the traditional nobility strikes back. And after Napoleon is finally defeated, then we have the Congress of Vienna. And that is where the European aristocracy gets together in order to create a new order in Europe. This Congress was led by Prince Clemens von Metternich of Austria. And this was an attempt to restore the balance of power in Europe, to create a Europe that is not torn apart by war. Now, remember, the context of the Congress of Vienna is that Europe has been at war for a quarter century with the wars of the French Revolution, Napoleon. So how do we create a concert, okay? Not like a rock concert, but a concert kind of like a classical music sort of thing, for stringed instruments working together. And how do we create stability within states and between states? And how do we make sure that liberalism and nationalism become things of the past? And this is the beginning of what's known as the Age of Metternich between 1815 and 1848, that of course comes to an abrupt end with the revolutions of 1848. But following the Napoleonic period, Europe had a period of almost unprecedented stability for several decades. And with this aristocratic resurgence that we see after the Congress of Vienna, we also see the rise of Romanticism. And Romanticism is a reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was all about rationality, but we know that human beings are very emotional creatures. And so Romanticism is all about embracing emotions and not being so rigid or rational. And the Romantics are responding to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, which we will talk about in the next unit. So with this, they are looking back, and for the first time in a long time, European elites are looking back to the Middle Ages. That's where we get all of these romances of knights and kings and queens, and all of a sudden the Middle Ages are beautiful, and we can look back. Now, another thing about the Middle Ages is that people were more religious. The church was more present, and with Romanticism, we see a religious revival. So it's important to note the cyclical nature of European history, where we have this very rationalistic Enlightenment followed by this Romantic movement, which is more about emotions. Romantic art tended to emphasize the beauty of nature. So while the Enlightenment is about, hey, look at all of this science and technology and all this stuff humans have created, Romanticism is much more about, look at what God created. Look at the clouds and the trees, and look at that lake over there, and look at how beautiful it is. And so this is what follows up this period of enlightenment. So we see the resurgence of aristocracy and the resurgence of a more mystical and religious and beautiful way of thinking. So what we've seen here in Unit 5 in the late 18th century, we see the rise of Britain as the dominant military power. And also we see that France is overwhelmed in this revolution caused by a failure of the monarchy and also these Enlightenment ideas. Now, this French Revolution started as a liberal movement, as a movement to make France in the model of the British constitutional monarchy. It quickly spun out of control and launched into the Reign of Terror, led by Maximilian Robespierre. Then it cooled off for a little bit, and then Napoleon finally brought France into the 19th century, into the true modern period as a nation. And remember these two themes of the French Revolution: liberalism and nationalism. Napoleon's conquest destabilized Europe, and the aristocracy responded with the Congress of Vienna, which implemented the concert system, where all of these aristocratic elites, they worked together to create several decades of peace, of stability within nations and stability between nations. And remember that the Romantic movement followed the French Revolution and was a rebellion against the Enlightenment, which we have already discussed, and the Industrial Revolution, which we will discuss in the following unit. So that's Unit 5, ladies and gentlemen, and it's always a pleasure.